The Ontario government cuts funding for AI research, and Google strips Huawei of their Android access. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The trade wars are heating up again, but before we get to that story, the Ontario government cuts funding for AI research. Doug Ford is poised to slash funding for two institutes that are credited with positioning Canada at the forefront of AI research and technology. These two organizations are the Vector Institute for AI, which lost about $20 million, and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which lost $4 million. Right off the bat, before we even get into any details, it's obviously a questionable move because that's where the future is heading. AI is a prominent emerging technology, and not putting resources forward to try and capitalize on that makes little to no sense. If you want to remain competitive and create jobs in a booming tech sector, you might want to provide those initiatives with the proper support so they can flourish. Unfortunately, that was not the case today. The two research programs I mentioned, the ones who are losing funding, are not entirely government funded though, so they have two options here. The first is to up their ante when it comes to external funds, such as sponsorship, or second, cut down their expenses accordingly, and that really presents a very interesting situation. The funding cuts save the government money in both cases, but the impacts are widely different depending on what happens here. If the two organizations respond by, for example, seeking other sponsorship or monetizing on their platform somehow, and they can recoup the loss, well, that's not really the worst case scenario. They can operate as normal, they have a new way of getting money, it's a win-win situation. The government lightens their burden, but at the same time, the institutes do not suffer. On the other hand, we have a tremendously more unfortunate possibility. If the funding is cut and the organizations can't do anything to recoup the loss, they'll need to cut their own expenses or sacrifice their own initiatives. That's a disaster and has major consequences in the long run. Jobs would immediately be lost because that's the quickest way to cut costs, and on top of that, the programs would probably lose some degree of effectiveness as they don't have the same resources anymore to operate functionally. This means that AI research gets dramatically worsened. That could leave Ontario in the dust internationally, and even provincially, as other areas continue to grow, it could pose problems from within Canada itself. The question is, which of these two situations that I outlined will happen? Will the companies be able to recoup the loss, or will they be forced to operate with a reduced budget? It's uncertain at this point, and that's why I have an issue with the move, the uncertainty. The risk of failure is evidently present, and it appears to be quite likely. A combined $24 million annually is being cut away. That's not so easy to come by, even if you try your hardest. It's very plausible that they won't reach that number. Additionally, the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity released a report last year in Ontario, and it's very ironic that it's contrasting with exactly what the Ontario government chose to not do. In the report, it states that Ontario has a rich AI ecosystem led by some of the world's best AI scientists and business professionals. It attributes the success in part due to early investment in research, and they also named the Vector Institute as an attractor of top talent in the region. This is to say, in other words, that the Vector Institute is so groundbreakingly positive that a bunch of top-tier scientists are actually going out of their way to try and work with them. And, as you might remember, the Vector Institute is one of the firms that is getting their funding cut. The report then eventually gets to a recommendation, and within that recommendation it says to stay ahead of the innovation curve, we have to continue to invest in cutting-edge AI research. The government has essentially done the opposite, as I just mentioned, and in the grand scheme, a $24 million saving is not that monumental. I fear the gains are minor here. You might save a little bit now, but the losses, especially in the long run, that could be huge. On top of all of this, the organization that put out the report, the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, that same organization was put out of business by the same government last week. This is after 18 years of research. The goal of that firm was to keep Ontario competitive by researching ways that we can do that. It's not so obvious sometimes, so this entity was tasked with keeping us up to date. Someone made a joke that the Ontario government will take money away from artificial intelligence and instead invested into artificial stupidity. I found that pretty amusing because, if I'm going to be quite frank, it certainly seems like that. There is definitely a time and place for cuts, but this is not the area. Research and academia, those should be held sacred. Those are what has propelled the human race forward, and impeding the process does not make sense to me. I've discussed the brain drain that Canada suffers from. That's in reference to top talent leaving Canada and going to the United States in search of better employment, better firms, more money, greater opportunity for growth, stuff like that. Even slightly less taxes depending on what area you want to live in. So the United States has a great edge, and it seemed like the Vector Institute was Ontario's way of combating that. It was a firm that was doing great work and people wanted to work for them. But now we've kind of cut them down a little bit, so maybe they lose their competitive edge. $20 million gone from their budget. Who knows what that was contributing to? If that's the case, the brain drain effect can definitely take hold, and it's not going to look good for Ontario. Those same applicants and researchers might go to work in the United States, or they might even look within Canada to other provinces. These cuts are only affecting Ontario. If another province decides to up their ante, or even recruits the Vector firm to relocate, that could incentivize people to move with it as well. It's, in essence, giving the company a motivation to not be here anymore because they're being treated badly. It's eerily similar to what happened with Amazon in New York. When Amazon was poised to open a headquarters there, but the New York Congress was acting so foolishly, they spurned them and they turned away. Hopefully it doesn't happen with the Vector Institute because that would be a real shame. This article got me thinking though. It's a very tricky situation when it comes to cuts. They are inherently perceived as a negative thing, which in reality isn't always the case. Every headline you read that say Ford has cut X, Y, and Z immediately gets a whiplash reaction from the populace, and certainly the groups who are directly affected. Everyone's complaining, everyone's rebelling, because there's a certain connotation here. Cuts equals bad is the typical consensus, and sometimes they're warranted, but I definitely can't rationale getting cuts towards education, research, and even healthcare for that matter. These are critical, you could even say pillars to Canada. Spending a little bit of money here and there, especially for these things, it's better to be overfunded than underfunded, I believe. Other areas where there's a little bit of leeway, sure, cut it here and there, get the budget in order. It's a very important initiative, but you have to be smart about how you do it. This goes back to something that Socrates said. He had a critique of democracy where it's easier to vote for the candy salesman versus the doctor. The candy salesman makes you happy immediately with short-term promises and sweets, while the doctor might inflict some short-term discomfort, but it's for long-term gains. Democracy is kind of set in a way where it's always the short-term that takes precedence, and people vote for that. They based on that criteria. So something like tax cuts. Short-term, extremely negative. The Candyman would never do that to you. But if you look at our budget in Ontario, having a deficit year after year, the interest payments, the foreign ownership that gets at stake because of that as collateral, it's a big issue. And getting it under control is not going to happen overnight. It's a long-term process, and due to that, it's not very popular when it comes to the voting people. This creates a very tricky minefield that you have to navigate through if you're a politician. If your long-term goal is to get the budget in order, you have to be extremely careful where you cut things because it's going to be perceived negatively anyways. So if you cut something that's actually critical, like the research for AI, it's going to be multiplied and the negative backlash you get is amplified tenfold. Cut something that's kind of crappy, you're still going to hear it. Cut something that's vital, you're going to hear it extra hard. Very difficult situation, and that's one reason why I try to be open-minded at first. There are certain areas where cuts are positive, getting rid of inefficient processes, adjusting supply to meet demand, reallocating funds to be more productive. All those things are very good. Unfortunately, in this situation here, it meets none of that criteria. These reductions have the ability to stagnate Ontario, and for what? $14 million? That's a drop in the bucket for the government budget. With great cuts come great responsibility. It has to be used wisely. I'm 100% positive that this is not the last of the cuts. So let's hope the future ones aren't as feeble-minded, and all we can do really is just wait and see. So now we get to the latest on the Chinese-USA trade war. Google withdraws Huawei's Android license. In the United States, this is the latest blow to China, and they've taken aim at Huawei, a Chinese state-owned telecom company. They've had a lot of issues within Canada. I've talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to touch on it this time, but let's focus on what Google did. One of Huawei's main products is their phone line, and it's become more and more popular because they have quite good specs, stuff like that. Traditionally, people use either Android or, if they're going to go iPhone, iOS operating systems to power their devices. Well, now all of that's going to change. Google is saying no way to Huawei. They've withdrawn the license to use Android operating systems and, on top of that, Google Apps. That is a major blow to Huawei. There's no more Android for you. You definitely can't use iOS. Now what do? You have to create a third one. They still have access to Google's open source software, but as I mentioned, that does not come with the usage of Google Apps and services. That right there is a major consideration alone. No more Google Apps? That means on top of creating a new OS, you'll need to do complete overhauls of basic essential Google apps that a lot of manufacturers take for granted. For example, make a new calendar app, a new Maps app, a new text-to-speech algorithm, and a vast swath of other things as well. Trump has two main issues with the company. The first is they supposedly violated sanctions with Iran, and that's why Canada extradited their CFO. The second is they pose a national security threat as they've been accused of spying and collecting data. One important thing to mention here is Google didn't really have a say in the matter. The US has Huawei flagged and they're on an entity list. This means they can't access American components, which Google falls under. All Google is doing is simply following a legal obligation. If it was up to them, I have no doubt they would not make this move. Google lets Saudi Arabia distribute a woman tracking application on their platform. This is not an ethics motivation. The company's just forced to do this. They're going to be losing out on profit, so the only reason why they're complying is because otherwise they're going to be fined or possibly sent to jail for illegally giving Huawei access to their software. So what happens from here? Huawei's phones definitely will lose some attractiveness. Maybe they can adapt. In the worst case, let's say the phone line fails, well, Huawei has a bunch of other services they can fall back on. They're well diversified in the realm of technology. Last year, the revenues were about $100 billion. Only a fraction of that was from their mobile devices. At the end of the day, it's a clear jab at China in relation to the trade war, and given China's track record, they're very likely to respond. The only question is, with what? Tune in next time and you'll find out. It's like a TV series now. What's China going to do? What's the US going to do? And at the end of the day, they're going to, make up and kiss and then go on their merry way. But until we get to that point, there's going to be a lot of turmoil. So stay tuned. So before we finish today, let's move on to a casual conversation about the Game of Thrones series. Well, it wasn't the season finale, the series finale. Overall, I found the episode to be okay. Oh, before I even get to this, luckily I didn't say anything yet, because 100% I'm going to be spoiling it because I have to. Some of the details I just have to talk about. So now back to my thoughts. I found the episode to be okay. It was maybe a 7 out of 10. But here's the issue. Game of Thrones is possibly one of the best TV shows ever. Well, at least that was true before season 8. So the audience was so used to a 10 out of 10 episode after episode, and we kind of got spoiled. Throughout season 8, as the production value and the storytelling and even the plot twist, they weren't really there at the same level. It was perceived as a much greater loss because you went from a 10 out of 10 or a 9.5 at the worst to now getting hit with a 6 or a 7. That 3-point drop was drastic and people didn't respond well to it. But today I'm going to talk about the last episode particularly. So I found it very lackluster. It didn't leave me feeling fulfilled. Dany, I don't even know what went through her head with that whole situation. They didn't properly develop her descent into madness. It seemed kind of crazy what was happening. It was so fast, and it didn't leave viewers with the proper rationale as to why things were happening. That's why I was left feeling like she wasn't so far gone. Now, in the director's minds, she may have been. They try to portray her like that, but it didn't come across that way. That's why when Jon killed her, I was wondering, did he really have to do that? Was there actually no opportunity for redemption? She didn't seem to be completely evil to me. Maybe she made a mistake. Maybe she was unaware of it. But to me, the path would have been further trying to convince Daenerys of the proper path forward. After all, she was motivated with noble means. She wanted this idea of paradise. She wanted people to be happy and free. The approach she took may have not been the right way, but her heart was in the right place, it seemed. Now you get to the crazy plot holes. After Jon kills Daenerys, the dragon takes her away, right? So how does Jon even get caught for this? There was no evidence. How did they even know he did it? The dragon literally grabs her and flies off into the distance, and there were 0 witnesses. What does Jon do? Does he confess to Grey Worm about what he just did? And on top of that, if he did confess, why would the Unsullied take him prisoner? It seems to me the immediate response would be to kill Jon. You saw the way they got when they executed Grey Worm's friend. I forget her name now. It's kind of escaping me. But they were avid. They were so avid they destroyed the whole city. Now, you killed their queen, and they're going to just take you prisoner calmly. That didn't make any sense to me. And they didn't really even go into depth what transpired there. That could have been a whole thing itself. How Jon goes about after killing her directly. But instead, it just flash forwards to him in jail. And Tyrion's there too. The craziest part to me was Bran Stark becoming the king. What, like, I don't know. To me, that was right out of left field, and it made like almost 0 sense. This is the same guy who was playing Bird Simulator when the Night King was about to kill everyone. On top of that, the character development really isn't there. It feels like Bran just some type of random weirdo. We don't really know too much about him. This whole 3-eyed raven thing, it felt really out of the blue, almost imaginative to a fault. And it was not what I was expecting. I would have been okay with a surprise ending, but this one didn't sit well with me. Well, and on top of that, when Tyrion says, what did he say? Something like, should you or do you want to be the king? And Bran's like, why do you think I came all this way? So Bran already knew. That's kind of crazy. He's like a fortune teller now. He kind of is mimicking the Big Brother system in like 1984. He knows everything you do. He knows your thoughts. He's the ultimate tyrannical emperor he could be. He has the potential to do that. Surveillance at all times. And why does he even need a master of whisperers at his council? This guy knows everything. And the best part, when they bring up democracy and everyone just laughs, the most realistic thing of the whole episode. It was a good attempt, very valiant, but we all knew it wasn't going to happen like that. Overall, you have to acknowledge Game of Thrones kind of fell off a cliff there with that last season, and it's kind of saddening. The show was truly amazing, and I'm going to cherish it as one of the best I've ever seen, but they did not do it justice at all. At the same time the season was going on, I was reading Blood and Fire. It's like the prelude to Game of Thrones when Aegon the First came and conquered the Seven Kingdoms, and the quality of the writing is just so good. Now, I'm comparing that to the TV series, and it's so bad. It's really clear that they lost their track, lost their vision here, and they needed the writer to help them out a little bit instead of them going Rambo and doing it themselves. It was not produced to the best of its ability, and it's truly a shame. But at the same time, it was enjoyable, and at least the memes were funny. The memes were probably better than the series finale itself. So there's that. Well, that about does it for today. Thanks for joining me on the Perry platform. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and follow us on Twitter at Perry Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.